Yeah, welcome back to ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidell. This is View from the North being mostly Canada. And we're going to talk to our Canadian friend of many years, Dr. Ken Rogers. We're going to talk about inflation today. Does inflation in the US affect inflation in Canada and elsewhere? We'll be right back to do just that. Welcome to the show, Ken. It's so nice to have you here. I
But
wanted to say that I don't know too many people who are as educated in the area of macro finance, macro economy as you are. You have graduate degrees all over the lot in that area. So I'm happy to talk to you.
well, many of those degrees are from many years ago, so there's updated technology and other means by which you certainly would have an outdated bit of knowledge.
Oh, well, we'll see about that. Anyway, so here we have inflation in the US. As it seems to be, modifying, and we should talk about how the Fed can affect and does affect inflation. Is the Fed successful these days?
I believe the Fed is successful because they you have to start off with what caused the burst of inflation that we have now, and it really started back in 2008, where there was extremely low interest rates and easy money for a long period of time, and that easy money doesn't flow to the public evenly. And so you had people with single family homes, gaining wealth at a pretty good pace and able to upgrade their housing. And similarly, the very wealthy players and professionals could buy common stocks. And so you had a great increase in the value of assets between, in the last 10 years. Well, then when you get COVID and suddenly the Federal Reserve opened the floodgates and they similarly Congress decided to really spend a lot of money to try to mitigate the effects of COVID. Well, the combination of the prior 10 years and all of that stimulus created the current inflation. The some of the inflation. Let's say you have three causes of inflation. One is demand pull. So during COVID, you had people sitting at home playing with video games. And so that Nintendo couldn't produce enough video sets. And used Nintendo sets were selling for about three times as much a few months into the COVID period as they were before, and so that huge increase in the price of Nintendo was kind of a demand pull type of inflation. Well, the Federal Reserve providing easy money and the U.S. Congress pumping money out to society, certainly that created a lot of demand pull for expenditures. Now you've got two other types of causes of inflation. One is called cost push. Well, if you have a strike of the federal government civil servants, which we had in Canada, about 3 weeks ago. It started and lasted for a couple of weeks, and the government gave them a 12% increase in wages spread over 3 years, plus a cash bonus to get back to work. Well, when you take 12% over 3 years, that's 4% a year. I mean, my simple mathematics, but if you're trying to say the target is to have 2% inflation, well, there's a major difference. You're dealing with a cost push, the cost being the wages and, wages of government employees, has a habit of spreading to other parts of the society. So if everybody got a raise of 4% when the target inflation was to be 2%, well, then you're going to have trouble keeping inflation at 2. And then that kind of leads to the third cause of inflation, and that's expectations. And that's the problem currently in Argentina in particular, but you got several other countries in the world where the inflation was sufficient that the public decided that there was just going to be the price of everything tomorrow was going to be higher than it is today. If they believe the future prices will be higher, they change all their habits. They immediately spend their cash faster. Well, that spending compounds the inflation.
So that means if the media tells us as a regular matter every single day that we're likely to have inflation because there's too much money in the system, because of all these things the government might have done or did during the COVID period, and then we get to expect that inflation, and that enhances the existing inflation. So perhaps you could say the more you talk about it, the more expectation you get, right?
Pretty well. Well, that was part of where the Federal Reserve and the Bank of Canada, Bank of England, the European Union did a great job of saying, for example, when Jerome Powell was talking about how did they decide what they were doing, it was pretty strong to say this may not be the end of it. We're gonna keep money tight for the whole rest of the year. We may even bump it up even further. And that jawboning is designed to really try to convince everybody to not have expectations that there will be inflation, that the Fed will stomp on it and succeed in eliminating the inflation.
Yeah, he'd be one source of information to the public, but he's not the only source. And there's the business writers, the opinion writers, the people on the media, and what they say counts. And with some people, what they say in the media counts more than what Jerome Powell says. No?
That's correct, because really they're what's on social media seems to be listened to more than any newscast or any of the major newspapers like Washington Post or New York Times. Not too many people read those anymore.
If I have these three factors in play, Ken, in other words, greater demand, greater money into the system from government or otherwise, and expectations are that there will be inflation. The public feels, the society feels that will be inflation. If I have all those things running, and I want to counteract them, I suppose what I do is what do? I increase the rate of interest, and that hopefully will stabilize the inflation.
Well, increasing interest, affects major parts of the economy, in particular housing, and housing is the largest part of the consumer price index or consumer expenditures. But that doesn't affect everybody evenly, and so but you also have things like in the news talks about supply chain problems. Those are really, cost push type of inflation. So if your federal government, if all levels of government reduce their spending, that will reduce inflation. If they increase their spending, if they're running at deficits, that will increase inflation. And interest rates, if they're increased, that will reduce inflation. If money's really cheap and abundant, that will tend to increase inflation.
So suppose the Fed makes a mistake, goes the wrong way, miscalculates where we're all going on this, fails to do the right thing at the right time, and we have inflation, such as in Argentina or in Germany after World War I, and we have runaway inflation. What happens to the value of the currency, and what happens to the society, the economy?
Well, coming back to your point, what if the Fed, doesn't fine tune it perfectly? I'm exaggerating the way you said that. However, historically, one of the United States' most famous economists, Milton Friedman, he always wrote articles that the Fed had screwed it up every time there was a recession, that they had put the brakes on too hard, they didn't ease it soon enough, that a mechanical handling of the money supply would be better than these people attempting to use their judgment to do it. However, you're correct conceptually that that they try to reduce demand, like increase interest rates until demand is reduced, but they don't wish to create a whole bunch of unemployment unnecessarily. While right now, there's the labor markets are such that there's very little unemployment, that despite the fact that the Fed has been very aggressive in raising interest rates, they have not caused a bunch of unemployment yet. It's still, the jury's still out, and the whole game's not over. But certainly, I think that they're doing a pretty admirable job, and each of the central banks, Australia, the United Kingdom, and Canada are all acting fairly much in unison. The European Union and Japan, they all have pursued tight money. They all had governments that spent a lot of money during COVID to increase demand. Everybody suffered from COVID-related supply chain problems, and now the world's trying to make a whole bunch of adjustments in supply chain. For example, who do you get your oil from? Who do you get your natural gas from? And you got clever governments, such as Norway. Norway is blessed with a lot of oil and gas, and they're just pumping it out as fast as they can, saying that everybody needs the energy. At the same time, Norway is using a bunch of that money to increase their efforts on climate control, or the climate change problems. They're ahead of most countries in the world in their efforts to deal with climate change, where Canada is really stupid. Our federal government policy in that same regard, we're blessed with a phenomenal amount of oil and natural gas. And today we have absolutely no natural gas from Canada is being exported in the form of LNG. Mm-hmm. From Canada, a bunch of Canadian gas is being shipped to the U.S., and the U.S. is in turn, pretty soon will be the largest exporter of liquid natural gas. But a bunch of it's Canadian.
That's interesting. Well, it leads to the question of how are we linked? Are we linked, completely to inflation in the U.S. and, for that matter, the success of the economy in the U.S. and Canada? I mean, you suggest that there's a relationship simply because our economies are so heavily linked. But is it one-on-one? Is it the kind of linkage that we can rely on, or could it change?
Yeah, when you're dealing with uh, trade items, uh, the United States is subject to lobbies that cause illogical results. One of the best examples between Canada and the US is softwood lumber. The US is suffering right now from, major push in inflation in the housing industry. And it's the cost of the good of materials that make up the house. Well, previously, Canada exported to the United States a way more softwood lumber than they now do. And it's because of the lobby interests that have simply had the U.S. take a policy that was in the interest of those lobbyists rather than the public good in the U.S.
So if you have rational public policy on both sides of the border, you're likely to have a more obvious linkage. But if you have irrational policies on one side of the border but not the other, then you are likely to lose that linkage. All right.
Well, you tend to have the same linkage, except it goes in jerks.
Mm.
And they're always jerks caused by American lobby.
Are you saying that the American lobbies, the American Congress, is not as rational as the Canadian lobbies in Congress, Parliament?
Oh, in regard to trade between the two countries, that's correct.
Mm-hmm.
As a generalization, though, that is not correct. Canada, I mean, there's outright stupidity in both places at times, such as there is no way that any reasonable person could explain McCarthy and the Republican position to not raise the debt ceiling.
Well, let's get to that. One thing you said a little while ago was that the world, and I guess that mostly is the first world, if you will, and that is Europe and Asia and U.S. and Canada, are really talking to each other, working with each other. They have the same larger problem, economic and inflation problems, and at least there's some linkage between all of those places. Nobody wants to be high inflation, more than the other guy, so they work together. And the question I put to you is, here we are on a cliff with McCarthy and the debt ceiling and the possibility of a default by the United States. What effect does that have on the global economy and on inflation here and elsewhere? I know that's a hard question.
It's yet to be seen.
Mm.
It really is. When Greece was going to default on its debt, before they were bailed out by the European Union or so on. What happened was, Greece had difficulty borrowing any money from anybody, and the cost of it went up. So one would say, if the US's credit is damaged, nobody wants to buy US currencies. So where the government is running at a deficit, how do you finance the deficit? And you have, old debt, which tends to roll over. So, new people need to buy those US government securities.
When you talk about Greece, it's an interesting example in the sense that the EU, a number of countries in the EU, bailed Greece out. And if they hadn't done that, there would have been really terrible result. So in the U.S., if
What
the
was
Congress,
terrible anyhow? It ended up
Yeah,
being a
that's true. That's
terrible
true.
result anyhow, and the bailouts had the conditions that Greece's economy sucks right now, still is a leftover from that mess.
Okay, but theoretically, the EU was asked to bail them out, could have bailed them out perhaps with fewer conditions in a more kindly way, and that would have helped. That was the idea. In the case of the US, if we don't find a solution, we wind up not paying our bills. What happens to do we? Is there a bailout out there? I mean, is the EU going to help us? Is anybody else going to help us, or are we
Well,
going to suffer it alone?
the key factor is who are the owners of the U.S. debt, and most of it is owned by American citizens, but an awful lot of it is owned by other countries in the world holding the currencies to handle international trade transactions. The US dollar is what is called a reserve currency, and it is the basis for most international trade. So other countries hold a stock of US dollars. Well, if I were China and Russia and I'm trying to give the United States a kick, I would certainly be dumping all of my US dollars, and really make the U.S. suffer in terms of, being unable to borrow at a reasonable price. High interest, interest rate go way up and, be extremely disruptive.
Yeah, so as a result, it would be harder for us to sell our paper on the international market. And if we couldn't sell our paper on the international market, what we'd have to increase in interest rates on the international market to make our paper more attractive.
Well, the Federal Reserve could print a bunch of money and buy the debt.
Hmm. What would happen to inflation?
That would really pump up a lot of inflation.
Right, because it's your three rules of inflation. You have all this new money dropping into the system, and that would, by definition, that would increase inflation. That would be really something.
A definition of inflation in first year economics books is too much money chasing too few goods.
Mm.
And that would do that. That would exaggerate the mess.
So we've been worrying about the reserve currency status of the American dollar for a long time, and that one day, people who are not necessarily our friends would establish another currency, another reserve currency, and displace the United States dollar. Any thoughts about what would happen if they were? How could they do that now? How could they be opportunistic? As against the McCarthy program and the failure to raise the debt ceiling. And if they were successful in changing the reserve currency, how would it affect our fiscal health and policy and our economy?
Well, the key players in that don't care.
Mm.
What happened? If anything, they wish the U.S. Have the worst of effects. But the U.S. dollar, really has worked well as a basis for almost all trade. But a huge percentage of the countries in the world just don't like that. Just it's partly psychological. It's partly because how the U.S. deals with them on trade. Because they deal where I use the term in U.S. Canadian trade is much better than between most countries of the world, but it has built in that the U.S. is a bully every so often. While vis-a-vis the rest of the world, U.S. treats them all worse than they do Canada.
Does that mean that if there was a problem with, the debt ceiling, and if, oh God forbid, the U.S. lost its corner on the reserve currency, that it would have a very negative effect in the U.S. and for the U.S. And there'd be a lot of anti-U.S. countries out there that would be clapping their hands. But how would that affect Canada? Would Canada be able to escape, the fallout that would, fall over the United States in that case?
Oh, the European Union, the G7, let's call it, those nations would continue to use the US dollar as a reserve currency. But it's not a hypothetical question because the BRIC, like BRICS, being Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They're meeting in South Africa sometime in the next month. And they have invited, about 20 other fairly significant countries, the ones whose economies are, they're not G7 like India is, but they're not far off, like, Indonesia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, in those scale of countries, are meeting, and part of their schedule is to discuss, can they create a substitute for the transactions between them that are not based on something other than the US dollar. So when they have trade, it's in a Zingo or whatever they want to call a new currency
Well,
that they would use to trade.
The Chinese yuan, right? And that would be a likely possibility, wouldn't it?
Well, China's the biggest player in that group, but I don't think everybody else would be that trusting. See, like in a sense, Brazil is not unfriendly with the United States. Neither is India. But they're trying to be, a little more what serves them best. And India, right now, they'll be friendly with Russia because they need an awful lot of energy, and Russia can sell them their energy at a discount.
So let me throw some other, events into the hopper here. There's so many events that could be disruptive and could create, disruptions in the American economy, and thus have some effect on Canada and, for that matter, on Europe and parts of Asia. But let me throw some possibilities. For example, we have this extraordinary rush to AI, where people are going to lose jobs. Certain professions are going to go away, where people in service industries will be able to do things much more efficiently, and thus not clear they'll be making the same amount of money. So this will, reduce payrolls. This will increase the payments made to tech companies that develop AI. This will change the way the economy works. Let me suggest that. So if that happens, how will AI affect the U.S. economy, and thus how will it affect inflation going forward?
I don't know. Historically, increases in technology have ended up, expanding employment in new areas. But as I see AI, it will tend to have a major effect on areas that it never affected before, but in particular, manufacturing and transportation. Like if you get self-driving vehicles, there's an awful lot of employment in that area that, people will be out in the street. Well, what jobs will replace those? And as far as I can see, this will be the first time that technology has resulted in perhaps fewer jobs, and certainly jobs that don't pay anymore.
But there are other things that could affect not only this country, but the world. For example, we could have all kinds of fallout in the migration of people in Europe, and for that matter, the migration of people across our southern border. We could have, we have political and geopolitical troubles hither and yon. And if we have a general destabilization in one continent or another, how would that affect, do you think? Is there any way to anticipate how that would affect inflation in the US or the countries that the US trades with?
Uh, well, I tend to think that the AI and technology is going to be very deflationary. Like
Mm,
its effect. It if you increase the efficiency of things, you should be reducing the cost of those things.
mhm,
You know, and so self-driving vehicles. Certainly, if you stood back and said, how much money would you save by not having to own two vehicles and simply taking a self-driving cab here and there? And that'd be a substantial saving in your costs. Now, just because there won't be a General Motors anymore, and all of those jobs, and Tesla will be manufacturing in China or somewhere. But key to AI, in my mind, is who has the lead in AI. Is certainly, I think that the United States is going to be pushed to keep up with China. And if China takes over Taiwan, and in a lot of ways, the main reason why they may not attack Taiwan is because Taiwan produces most of the world's computer chips that really count.
mm.
And if you blow up that the factories that produce those, or you're fighting the people, that is going to create a major mess.
What about the migrant problem in Europe and Africa, in the Middle East? There are people moving by hundreds of thousands or even millions. There are people who are displaced all through that part of the world, and that displacement, any displacement anywhere in the world, has got to have a huge effect on the economy. And I just wonder what effect it would have, is likely to have on inflation for the rest of us.
Well, and Canada's a little cushioned in that regard because it's very hard for somebody to walk across the border.
Mm.
Because the only border is with the US. Now we've had a ton of people that actually have come all the way from, whether it's Haiti, Venezuela, Peru, or whatever, the people that the US complains, or certainly the Republicans do, there's too many of them at your southern border. An awful lot of them are making it up to New York State to try to get across the Canadian border, where they just happen to have changed the rules with that. So Canada doesn't really have that problem in that regard, but Canada's out trying to get a greater number of immigrants than they've ever had. But when you're sitting in an isolated spot like Canada or Australia are, then you can cherry pick among the migrants. We have, if you take India or Pakistan as examples of places where you have millions of people would like to move from India or Pakistan to any of, Britain, Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, they'd even take, most of Europe, even if the language is not English. where in India they speak English. Well, if Canada's advertising, if you have a college degree in computer science, we'll make it easy for you to come to Canada.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
one other
so
thing
that,
that we probably don't have time to discuss, but maybe you have a quick thought about it, is climate change. So you see these wildfires, you see floods and droughts, you see large climatic shifts. Really, everywhere in the world is subject to that. And if I have to spend money putting out fires, literally, if I have to spend money rerouting, dealing with floods and droughts and rerouting water for agriculture, I'm spending a lot of money, am I not? And the question is whether the general rule that you articulated earlier about if you spend a lot of money, then you have inflation. So if I have what do you want to call a climactic disruption, or for that matter, spending money on trying to ameliorate climate change, um, is that create inflation? Can I look forward to an inflationary spiral because it will catch up with us?
uh, it varies as to how that's done. I mean, if you're to take the mess on Florida, where it was south of Tampa, where all of those communities were just washed right out. Now, rebuilding those, would you call that inflationary? I mean,
Yeah.
there's going to be demand for building materials and demand for construction labor, and the costs to rebuild may be higher than they would have been if the flood had never happened and there was only going to be a couple of houses built. But uh, that's an isolated area that doesn't have any effect on the price of most things in Portland, Oregon.
What I get is that these isolated areas may increase, and they may be in more places than we might expect that we have had historically, happen even over the past few years.
Well,
And
we're having that right now in Western Canada. We have a phenomenal number of forest fires in north central Alberta. And now Alberta is about the same size as Texas, and about half of it is subject to major fires right now. And in fact, I think there's about 10% of the oil industry's been shut down because of the fires that are nearby. And similarly, in British Columbia, we had an awful lot of sent to us from Hawaii, the moisture over the winter. And so in the mountains, we had phenomenal snowpack. We had a wonderful ski season, but now the snow is melting, and when it rains, it's coming too fast. And so we have floods in a bunch of areas in British Columbia right now.
well, that's the kind of thing I mean. This kind of climactic change. On the one hand, you spend more money, and on the other hand, where does that come from? That money?
Well,
There's no great fund. And what I would like to do, Ken, is continue this discussion about where climate change has an effect, whether the effect different in different parts of the world, at least for now, and the economic effect and the inflationary effect is different. We're going to have to go now because we're out of time, and there'll be another show here soon. But I really enjoyed this discussion. I learned a lot, more than I knew before, for sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Ken Rogers, retired businessman in Kelowna, Canada, helping us understand these macroeconomic issues that connect us with Canada and the rest of the world. Thank you so much, Ken.
Yeah, sorry we got off of inflation a bit, but I enjoyed the diversions.
Hello. Hello.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, Please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.